This is Event Horizon, and I'm your host, Mark Anthony Peterson. This is the podcast that takes you on a walk into the paranormal with a splash of conspiracy. This is the podcast that would be born if David Icke and the X-Files had a baby. Guys, welcome to episode 21, entitled, Where is the Garden of Eden? I know. I promised you I was going to answer the question of who is God. I started researching for that episode and realized I had to answer this question first. The Garden of Eden. I kept rereading Genesis and realized I could not get to the God question until I answered the garden question. Where is the Garden of Eden? Guys, you're going to have to buckle in because this episode is a wild ride. Lots of research went into this episode to ask the question, where's the Garden of Eden, and to try to find an answer. Can't promise you you're going to like the answer, but I think I'm on to something here. Now again, disclaimers. I'm no religious scholar. I'm not a physicist. I just research and analyze and then share my thoughts with you. Hopefully they inspire you, make you think. And if you think I'm crazy or just dehydrated because I do get out in the sun an awful lot, please let me know. And some of you have started reaching out to me and inspiring me to keep going down this path. And to you, Tracy, I'd like to say thank you. So before I jump in and give you the show summary, I'm going to hydrate. Get a little kombucha. Got a little ginger lemon this week. And then we're going to jump in and I'm going to tell you what I was thinking. And then we're going to dig into the facts just like we always do. Okay, let's hydrate. That's some good kombucha. Okay. Point 1. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. But shortly after that, God's Spirit hovered over the water. That's verse 2. So what I argue at that point, God is placing his essence in the heavenly water and made first man not made of carbon, using that heavenly water. We all know that we are made up of a majority of water. Our organs, brain, and heart have even higher percentages of water than the rest of our body. So in the beginning, this water that God speaks of in Genesis is imbued with his essence and then used to make man. Now, that's an important distinction that I want you to remember when we start to ask the question, who is God? Because we want to know how God got into this plane, and that's exactly how God made his way into this plane, is by putting his essence into the water and making man. Point 2, God created a garden for mankind, but I don't think it was an actual garden. Gardens are symbols for consciousness or an image of the soul. Now, you've listened to my other podcasts and you know what I say about the soul. That it is a piece of consciousness wrapped in DNA that lets us act as independent standalone computers. So the garden in the Bible is not an actual garden, but a representation of God's consciousness, right? Like I said, God was always there, and the garden is a representation of his consciousness, a reflection, an image of his consciousness. That's an important distinction. Continue to write that down, because that reflection or essence of God in the water is a very, very important point as we move forward. Now, just to contrast, a forest in literature and in the Bible is representative of the feminine, womanhood. That's why we say virgin forest. So a garden is a representation of God's consciousness, or as we would think about it in terms of the Matrix, the movie, it's the construct, the plane on which all other things are created. Is it starting to resonate with you now? So the garden is the space where God created everything. It's the construct where all material goods could be moved in and out of realities. Right? We all saw the Matrix. When Neo and the crew went back into the Matrix, they took stuff with them that came out of the construct, that white room where anything could be created and then brought into the Matrix. So that consciousness, that construct, is another word for garden. I know you're thinking, Mark, wow. I'm going to cite some sources of people who think the exact same thing. I'm also going to give you the Hebrew translation for the words in the Bible. And I'm telling you, this stuff is going to start making more sense to you. Point 3, to give man a chance at salvation, God created 3 gardens, the Holy Trinity, Father, Son, and Holy Ghost. So you had to have 3 gardens to give man a chance at salvation, with the 3rd garden having Jesus playing an important role as an element in the garden, in the construct. Point 4, the first garden was a cross-dimensional, multi-universal garden where man stood with God as a silicon-based entity. Because man was a multi-dimensional, multi-universal, or multiverse capable in the beginning. Point 5, 2 trees were planted in the first garden. The tree of life, which Paul Edwards in his work Tracking Down the Forbidden Fruit argues is an olive tree, or symbolized by an olive tree in the Bible. And the second tree is the tree of knowledge, which is symbolized by the tree vine, or a vine of trees, or as Paul Edwards called, a grapevine. So the tree of knowledge was a grapevine. The tree of life was an olive tree, according to Paul Edwards. And I agree with him. That's going to be explained a little bit more when we unpack all of this. Point 6. Man was given dominion over the second garden, not the first. The first garden, man was not carbon-based. The second garden, man became carbon-based and was in a different plane, but was given dominion over that plane in that garden. And you're going, wow, really? Yeah. When you get deeper into Genesis, you realize that God speaks of 4 rivers that cut through the garden. Most people have gone to look for those rivers on the planet. They're not going to find them and find the garden, because we're not talking about a physical garden. We're talking about the creation of man. And the 4 rivers don't represent actual rivers. They represent the 4 dimensions that govern our plane: height, width, length, and time. Yeah. So when we start talking about the creation of a reality from a consciousness, you move from a garden that is multidimensional, multi-universal, down to a garden that has specific rules that are governed by 4 dimensions. The ones that we live in and the ones that we have dominion over. all other dimensions and universes outside of what was defined in the second garden, man has no dominion over. Point 7. Eve is told not to eat from the tree of knowledge. Now, I mentioned earlier that the tree of knowledge is a grapevine. Paul Edwards' work, Tracking Down the Forbidden Fruit, argues that this fruit was not an apple, but it was grapes. Because the Bible speaks of a tree of vines as being the forbidden fruit. I'm going to put a link to that article in the show notes so that you can read through what Paul Edwards has to say and track back to the Bible verses to see exactly what he's talking about. Because it's important that you know that it is a grapevine. Why? Because grapes are the source for wine. And wine is a symbol. That's point 8. Grapes are the source for wine. And wine in the Bible is a symbol for what? Blood. What did I tell you in the last episode? The key to the Mandela effect is the blood. And the blood is consciousness, universal consciousness. So by eating from the forbidden fruit, the grapevine, the symbol for wine or blood, Eve was disrupting the swarm intelligence that we talked about in episode 12. See, consciousness at the level of a God gives you the ability to discern good from evil, to notice it. The swarm intelligence made you one with God. You didn't have to worry about that. But once you became conscious at that level, now you could not remain on the same network with God. But that's what that process represented. That's what the Bible, in my opinion, is speaking of. Eating of the grapevine or of the blood tree brought in a consciousness that Eve and Adam never should have had. They should have remained a part of the swarm intelligence on the God network. Point 9, Jesus, the second Adam, had to rectify the situation. He came back as the true blood, the true consciousness, which is why we have the sacrament on every Sunday where you drink his blood, because he represented the salvation, the true blood that corrected the sin that happened in the second garden. Remember, the Last Supper. Jesus left from the Last Supper and went to the third garden at the Mount of what? The Mount of Olives. The Mount of Olives represents one of the two trees in the garden, Jesus being the second tree. The tree of life, the tree of blood. There's a reason why Jesus turned water, or the essence of God, into blood, giving you the full cycle, the full effect of the salvation. So see why I had to go down this path first? To get to the question of who is God, I had to unpack the whole question of where's the Garden of Eden. Can't find it because it was a spiritual construct. First garden, we walked alongside God as a silicon-based being, crossing dimensions, crossing universes, existing outside of time, superposition, could experience all because we were all. No fear of the mountain because you were the mountain. Second garden, there were 4 rivers or 4 dimensions, and you were much more limited in your ability to interact, but you still had a direct line to God. After eating of the blood tree, a third garden had to be constructed, and one of the elements in the garden had to be the true blood, the new consciousness. Listening to it like this, you now understand why the corruption of the bloodline is such a critical objective for those who don't want Christ to win. Because that consciousness is all a part of defining which network you're going to operate on, as a heavenly or as a demonic being. It's all starting to make sense? Maybe it doesn't. So we're going to start now unpacking this bit by bit. Okay, Genesis 1. I argue in Genesis 1, God creates the multiverse. So let's get into that. Genesis 1. In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. The Hebrew word, now, if you are Jewish, please forgive my pronunciations. I'm going to do the best that I can with these words. Shemehim means heaven, sky, visible heavens, heaven as a realm of stars. So this Hebrew word is constructed of 2 parts. Shem, derived from the Akkadian shamu, meaning sky or lofty, and the Hebrew mehim, meaning water. Put them together, heavenly, lofty water. Now, water, as we know, represents life, and is also associated with birth, fertility, refreshment. In the Christian context, it represents a rebirth. Right. We get baptized in and out of the water because we believe the water imbues us with an essence, with a purification of our soul, and reborn with a new soul. Why is that? Because, as I argue in our summary, when God created the plane, or before he created the plane, his spirit hovers above the water, and the water then becomes imbued with his essence. Holy water, right? So when you're baptized in holy water, you come out with the essence of God. So this term, when we think of heaven, we're really looking at a phrase that says holy water. God created the holy water. Okay, let's break apart the second word. The Hebrew word for earth was eretz, E-R-E-T-Z, which means land or promised land. So you created the lofty, holy, heavenly water in a promised land. That's different from creating a planet. That could mean a lot more than just a planet. It could mean a whole universe. And that's what I'm arguing is happening in Genesis 1. So if I were to reinterpret what I see in Genesis 1, it would read, in the beginning, God created sky water, or the cosmos, and the land, which, when we think about the abundance of elements in the universe, silicon is one of the most abundant. So God created the sky, water, cosmos, and silicon. And then the multiverse with no barriers, at least initially, when that first garden was created. One could move freely through all the dimensions, experience them, and freely through all of the universes, and experience them because of the possibility of superposition. You were at all places at all time. Now, why do I think this is true? Because in 2 Kings 6:17, we read, "And Elijah prayed, 'Open his eyes, Lord, so that he may see.' And then the Lord opened the servant's eyes, and he looked and saw the hills full of horses and chariots of fire all around Elisha." Don't you think that verse is speaking of opening up the door between dimensions and seeing all sorts of craft and beings that exist in that plane? So yes, God created that initial plane with no barriers and an open garden where the first man was created. Next point that I want to emphasize. Genesis 1 and 2. God imbues the water with his essence. Let's read Genesis 2. "And the earth was without form and void, and the darkness was upon the face of the deep. And the Spirit of God moved upon the face of the waters." How many of you are familiar with the late Dr. Marsu-Emoto's work? Dr. Emoto believed that water could store information and that it reacts to music, written words, prayers, feelings, and thoughts. He did several experiments where he took water, divided it up, and in one batch of water wrote negative things on the outside of the jars where the water was stored. He would also have students come in and say very negative things about that section of water. He had another section with jars with positive words written on it, and students were instructed to say only positive things and play classical music for that particular batch of water. After a period of time, and you'd have to look at the video to get the specific amount of time, they would flash freeze the water and then cut them into slices and examine them under a microscope. The water that was treated poorly looked like gunshot wounds. Very, very disturbing formations, violent looking formations in the water crystals that were formed by flash freezing. Those with the positive reinforcement, the positive words written on the outside of the jars, formed the most beautiful symmetrical crystals you've ever seen. I think Dr. Emoto was capturing what is reflected in Genesis 2. "And the Spirit of God moved upon the face of the waters." So the mere presence of God near water put his essence into the water, changing it into water that we would consider divine. So Dr. Emoto's work is not altogether different from the Catholic belief in holy water. I'm going to put links to Dr. Emoto's website and his YouTube video in the show notes. Please take a look at it. It was inspiring to me when I first saw it and put me on the track to the things that I'm telling you right now about history that we have not been told about our existence on this plane. When you look at Dr. Emoto's work and when you read Genesis 2, you understand the importance of positive reinforcement on the people around you. Because if your essence can be captured in the water, the way God's was with holy water, the cosmos in the beginning, imagine what you do when you are positive or negative with the people around you. Up to 60% of a human adult's body is water. According to H.H. Mitchell in the Journal of Biological Chemistry, our body is made up of 60% water. The brain and the heart are composed of 73% of water. The lungs, 83%, and the skin, 64%. and the kidneys 79%, and our bones are also made of some water, 31%. So the essence of whatever is around us can easily be absorbed into who we are. And that, my friends, is the blessing and curse of the original sin. By eating of the tree of knowledge, the grapevine, the tree of blood, Eve and Adam opened the door to having our essence be affected by everything around us, good and bad. And it doesn't have to be a conscious thought or an overt thought. It could be all around us. Music, written word, prayers, feelings, thoughts, all of those things can now be reflected in our consciousness because we are made of the water that can capture it like a net capturing fish. In the first garden, we didn't have that. But we had it after it was consumed in the second garden. So you see why you had to have a third garden, a new blood, to correct that. Again, to reemphasize what we said in previous podcasts, your DNA is a part of the soul, which is the physical manifestation of your consciousness, because your DNA is a time machine. It reflects all of who you were and all of who you will be. So what do I mean by that? Will be. Everything that your water essence is absorbing is affecting your DNA. Yes. Everything around you, all the stuff that people are doing to the environment, all the places that you live, good or bad, things that are said, good or bad, are being absorbed into your body, affecting your DNA, affecting who you and the generations to come after you will be. Are we starting to get it now? And how this whole ancient artificial intelligence crept onto the scene to try to break this link between us and God. Okay. Next point. Genesis 6-8 is where I argue God created the barrier between the multiverse. Let's read it. And God said, "Let there be a firmament in the midst of the waters." Okay, now back to the very first point. The definition of heavens and earth is when we started talking about the sky, holy waters, and the cosmos. So let there be a firmament in the midst of the cosmos, and let it divide the cosmos from the cosmos, or divide the waters from the waters. And God made the firmament and divided the waters which were under the firmament from those that were above the firmament. And it was so. Verse 8, and God called the firmament heaven, and in the evening and morning were the second day. We're not talking about putting a dome above earth. We're talking about putting a barrier between each of the universes in the multiverse that exist. Remember, God's Spirit hovered above the waters, the heavenly waters, which is a representation of consciousness in the waters. Then he divided those waters with a barrier, separating water from water, or consciousness from consciousness, or a plane of existence from a plane of existence, with the barriers. Is that making sense to you now? When I reread it and thought about it in that context, I was like, wow. Just a mere translation of one word in the Bible opened up a new way to think about these early verses. Because we haven't even gotten to the creation of the planet and man yet in the terms that we know them today. Those first 4 or 5 or 6 verses in Genesis are all about creating the universe in totality and then dividing it up into the dimensions and the multiverse. And 6 through 8, to me, is clearly saying dividing water from water, the essence of God from the essence of God, and creating individual slices of existence. So there has to be an interdimensional door to move across these and experience all those planes of existence. Reza Aslan published a work called God, A Human History in November 6, 2017. In that work was a beautiful picture of what it was like when God's Spirit hovered above the water. In the work, Aslan says, think of God as a light that passes through a prism, refracting into countless colors. The individual colors seem different from one another, but in reality, they are the same. They have the same essence. They have the same source. In this way, what on the surface seems separate and distinct is in fact a single reality. So God's Spirit hovering above the water, imbuing it with His essence, and then shining through a prism, creating the individual universes with slight distinctions, only from a certain point of view, refracted light. The barrier being where one color ends and the next begins, but it all has the same source and the same essence. And so when God creates that refracted light, let there be light, there's as many dimensions as there are colors, each one of them having a barrier between them, the firmament, but still the same essence and a single source. And that's one way to think about it. And of course, if you do this same experiment at home, you'll see how water reflects light, bends light in the way that we think of when we put a prism in front of a light source. And so that's why I argue that in those verses you see God creating the multiverse in those early verses of Genesis, and then moving into the creation of earth as we get into the 9th and 10th verses. So let's talk about those. Genesis 1, 9 through 10, and 14 and 19 is where we see the actual creation of earth and the first earthly day. Let's read those. And God said, let the waters under the heavens be gathered together in one place, and let the dry land appear. And it was so. And God called the dry land earth, and the gathering together of the waters called the seas. And God saw that it was good. Verse 14. And God said, let there be lights in the firmament of the heaven to divide day from night, and let them be for signs and for seasons and for days and years. And God made 2 great lights, the greater light to rule the day, the lesser light to rule the night. He made stars also. And God said, let them set in the firmament of the heaven and give light upon the earth. Verse 18. And to rule over the day and over the night, and to divide the light from the darkness. And God saw that it was good. Verse 19. And the evening and the morning were the 4th day. As I've said in previous podcasts, here is where I believe the first earthly day began, with the beginning of Genesis 1 and 9. Prior to that, there was no earth. There was no land gathered together in one space to be called the earth. Everything else was the multiverse and the dimensions. And as you can see at this point, where God talks about in verse 14, we get the first element of the dimension, time. Let there be lights in the firmament in the heavens to divide day from night, and let them be signs for the seasons and for the days and the years. Prior to that, there was no time in this plane. Now, as we know, once this is created, we're on the path to create the second garden, the garden that will have these 4 dimensions in it. But before we get to the garden, we got to get to man. And I'm arguing that there are 2 men that were created. I tell you in episode 12 that I think that there was a previous man made of silicon that walked with God before God had to create a second man made of carbon. And it's right there in Genesis. Yeah, I know some of you guys are going, wow, Mark, you're really packing a lot in here. I felt I had to before I could go back and ask the question, who is God? Okay, Genesis 1. I think God creates the first silicon beings starting in chapter 26. Then in Genesis 2 and 7, we get the carbon-based versions. Okay, let's go through it. Genesis 1 and 26. And God said, let us make man in our image, our likeness, beings of light. That's what God is. So he was making the first man in his image. And let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, over the fowl of the air, over the cattle, over the earth, and every creeping thing upon the earth. So God created man in his image, and in his image he created him male and female. So he made both man and woman at the same time in his image to rule over a cosmos. Because when you look at what earth is in these verses, it's not capital, and it's referring to a different Hebrew word, as I mentioned earlier, from Genesis 1 that means heavenly water or cosmos. So man was given dominion over the cosmos, the multiverse, initially because he was in God's image. God blessed them and said unto them, be fruitful, multiply, and replenish the earth or cosmos and subdue it. You have dominion over it all. That's in Genesis 1, 26 through 28. But then move forward into Genesis 2 and 7. Now listen to how different this sounds than Genesis 1 and 26. And God formed man from the dust of the ground and breathed into his nostrils life. And man became a living soul versus what he was in verses 26, Genesis 1 and 26. 2 distinct beings. And then God planted a garden eastward in Eden and put man whom he had formed in that garden. Isn't that telling you something different than what you've been taught? Man was initially given dominion over the cosmos, over all dimensions and over all versions of the universe. Then God had to create a different man from the dust of the ground and place him in a different plane, Eden. Okay? So the second garden emerges when we look at Genesis 2. The initial garden, if you go back and look in the first 5 verses of Genesis, where the trees and the fowl of the air, those were all part of the initial first garden, which is the cosmos. Is everybody following? Everybody getting it with me? I know this requires a lot of kombucha. I've gone through 2 bottles just in this episode, pushing for a case. Okay, now we're ready to start digging into where's the Garden of Eden. I think you've gotten big chunks of it, right? It's not a real garden. It's a plane of existence that has 4 rivers or 4 dimensions that we can operate in. Time, which you just heard me outline the first moment where time began on day 4 of God's creation plan. And then the rest of the planes are symbolized by the rivers. The 4 rivers represent the 4 dimensions in our garden. Cool? Cool. So according to fandom.com, a garden is a symbol of consciousness, soul, and innocence. Gardens are considered a divine feminine. So when we think of the Garden of Eden, it is a plane of existence, a plane of consciousness governed by 4 dimensions. So we got a limited slice of God's reality when put into the Garden of Eden. Still connected to God, but no longer dominion over all of the multiverse. So God created the Garden of Eden with part water and part fruit. And water, as we've talked about, is fundamental for purification, cleaning away debris. Think baptism, right? Water gardens serve as a catalyst for healing, for cleaning out emotional waste. Fruit gardens are symbols of sustenance, community, and survival. So we have a Garden of Eden that is made up of water and fruit and knowledge, that has 4 rivers that represent the dimensions that God wanted man to experience in his plane. That's where we begin. Now let's dig in. Where is the Garden of Eden? Where is this consciousness plane that we call Eden? The name Eden is derived from the Akkadian term edinu, which means plain. Wow. I'm not making this stuff up. Edinu, Akkadian, means plain. So the first Eden was created, I argue, in Genesis 1 and 11. And God said, let the earth bring forth grass, the herb yielding seed, and the fruit tree with yielding fruit after his kind, whose seed is in itself upon the earth, and it was so. Verse 12, and the earth brought forth grass, and the herb yielding seed after its kind, and the tree yielding fruit, whose seed was in itself after his kind, and God saw that it was good. So that first garden that God created was the garden that governed the cosmos. It had the experience of all 10 dimensions that I talked about in previous podcasts, and it had in it the 2 main trees that we see turn up again in Eden. The tree of life, represented by the olive tree, and the tree of knowledge, represented by the grapevine. These trees extend across all dimensions. And it's funny, when you research the Hadron Collider at CERN, that's exactly what the scientists are looking for. They actually are looking for what they believe is the outline of what looks like a tree that extends across all dimensions. One light and one dark. The tree of life and the tree of knowledge. Interesting that what is written in the Bible, the physicists of the world are seeing represented in the planes that we are talking about here in the podcast. Second Eden, we go to Genesis 8 and 9. And God planted a garden eastward in Eden, and he put man whom he had formed. And out of the ground made the Lord grow every tree that is pleasant to the sight and good for food, and the tree of life also in the midst of the garden, and the tree of knowledge of good and evil. So that tree that was there originally in the garden was made available in that plane in the Garden of Eden. And that's exactly how it's written. See, God made every tree grow that was pleasant to the sight and good for food, semicolon, the tree of life also in the midst of the garden, and the tree of knowledge of good and evil. Those appeared because those were there from the garden that governed the cosmos. Now we know what happened in that second Eden. There was forbidden fruit, the grape, the wine, the blood, all of the symbology that I talk about in the summary that caused man, Adam and Eve, to be expelled from the second garden. And by being expelled from the second garden, we were removed from the network. As carbon-based beings, we were removed from the network that connected us to God. Now, we had to have salvation, so there needed to be a third garden, a garden at Gethsemane on the Mount of Olives. And that's where Jesus and his disciples retired after the Last Supper, at the Mount of Olives. Yes, the tree of life. Why is the olive tree considered the tree of life? Because the tree can grow to about 18 to 20 feet in height. Its trunk becomes contorted and twisted with numerous branches. It develops slowly and can live literally centuries. There are olive trees that have been alive for 1,000 years. You can remove its trunk and its roots continue to grow. And for it to be a fully realized olive tree, it has to be spliced. Gathering of the fruit of the olive was and is still considered today an exercise in shaking the tree and its branches vigorously and causing the olives to fall to the ground. Sometimes the branches are beaten with poles to facilitate the dropping of the fruit. As I mentioned, if you cut the trunk down of the tree, the shoots from the roots will continue to grow, ensuring continued existence. Tree of life. The olive oil was used as a fuel for the lamps in the tabernacle and is an essential element in the daily meal offerings. Olive oil was often used also to anoint the head and body after a bath. The olive tree is considered the king of trees because it was often used as part of a holy anointing ritual for many kings and royalty. Jesus would send his disciples out to heal the sick and preach the gospel. And when they would cast out demons, they would anoint those individuals with the olive oil, especially those who were sick, and it healed them. So the olive oil was almost acting like a conduit, opening the door for God's spirit or essence to enter the bodies of those that had been possessed by demons. As I mentioned, kings were anointed. In Hebrew, the term Messiah literally means anointed one. And it's not a coincidence that the dove that returned back to Noah after the flood was carrying an olive branch. Tree of life. Let's dig a little deeper into this olive tree. The Hebrew word for olive tree is es-shemen, which means tree of oil. It is primitive root word meaning to shine, beings of light, right? The first man, being of light. So rubbing yourself in the oil is a throwback to the being of light where God made man in his image. And so the tree of life is the path back to where we were. It anoints you and opens your spirit as a conduit to allow God's essence to flow back into you. The word es-shemen is related to the word shemesh, which means to be brilliant, which is also the Hebrew word for sun, that brightly shining orb in the sky. So you see the importance of the olive oil in the context of the gardens, why it crosses all planes. So in the original garden, you had the tree of life and the tree of knowledge. In the Garden of Eden, you had the tree of life and the tree of knowledge. Eve partook of the tree of knowledge, as did Adam, disrupting the relationship between man and God. And a third garden was created, and Jesus stood alongside the tree of life at the Mount of Olives as the second tree. The Hebrew word for olive is zaith, meaning an olive, as yielding illuminating oil. It is related to the word ziev, meaning to be prominent, brightness. Spell that Z-I-V if I mispronounced it. Now, what's important to note about an olive tree is that in its wild state, it's small and worthless. It must be properly tended to and cultivated to produce the best fruit. And to truly produce the best fruit, the olive tree must be grafted, a process by which good stock is made to grow upon the wild shrub. That's important for understanding why we have the multiverse. We all know the passage in the Bible it was spoken that God has many rooms in his mansion. And that could easily be many universes in the multiverse, where good stock is taken and grafted onto the wild shrub to produce optimum fruit. Mark that part in the tape, because we're going to come back to that when thinking about the tree of life and whether or not there's extraterrestrial beings that are on some branch of the tree of life, and whether or not the good stock has to be grafted onto the wild shrub in order to produce optimum fruit. I'm starting to sound like the X-Files, right? Hybrid humans. We'll get there. But first, we got to finish asking these questions. Where's the Garden of Eden? Who is God? Before we get further down the branch of the tree of life. Okay. So we've gotten our hands around the olive tree and the tree of life, and the fact that that was where Jesus went after the Last Supper, creating the scenario for the third garden, with the olive and the Mount of Olives representing one half of the equation, and Jesus, the true blood, the true consciousness, representing the other element of the tree in the garden. So, the tree of knowledge. Paul Edwards, as I mentioned earlier in his work, Tracking Down the Forbidden Fruit, argues that the tree of knowledge is a vine bearing grapes. He points to the fact that Samson's mother was forbidden from eating anything from a grapevine. That's in Judges 13 and 14. So, if grapes or the vine-bearing trees represents the forbidden fruit, and grapes being the fruit from that vine, it's not so much the fruit itself, but what it symbolizes. You create wine. Wine was the symbol for the blood, and the blood, in my view, is a representation of the consciousness that is represented in every person. Your unique DNA that captures the time machine that reflects who you are. And so, taking from the tree of knowledge corrupted the consciousness that God had set in place in the early part of Genesis. And it needed to be corrected with the true blood. And so, as Peter Edwards argues, John 15 and 1, Jesus calls himself the true vine, as in true grapevine. John 15 and 1 reads, I am the true vine, and my Father is the gardener. Verse 2, He cuts off every branch in me that bears no fruit, while every branch that does bear fruit, he prunes so that it will be even more fruitful. Verse 5 in the same chapter. I am the vine, you are the branches. If you remain in me and I in you, you will bear much fruit. Apart from me, you can do nothing. So it's clear that Jesus is positioned as the second vine, the true blood, the true consciousness. So where's the Garden of Eden? The Garden of Eden started out as a garden that made up all of existence. It was consciousness. It was a plane, as the Hebrew word for Eden explains. A consciousness, a plane of consciousness was created, where all dimensions were capable of being experienced by beings that were made in the likeness of God. The second Eden, man was made from the dirt of the ground and restricted to 4 planes or 4 dimensions of existence within the consciousness of God. Man's sin forced him from the direct communication with God, but maintained us within those dimensions. We were fallen angels. But in that, and in this explanation, I want to make clear that our connection to God in this plane was his essence. God's spirit hovered above the water, as I mentioned with Dr. Emoto's experience, and he imbued the water with his essence. Our connection to God was through the water. And the tree of life provides the conduit through which that essence can flow into us. So God exists outside of everything that was created, but exists in the essence of the consciousness that was imbued into this plane and into our existence and into us as water beings with DNA as independent operating units. So does that get it for you? And then the third garden had a stand-in tree in Jesus representing the new knowledge, the true knowledge. So when you go back through my previous episodes, it starts to make sense for those who do not want to see a return of this swarm intelligence, of the 2 things you have to do to stop it. You got to contaminate the blood. The blood is the source of power in the consciousness, and it always has been that fight from the beginning of the written scriptures. And it continues today. And you can see it reflected on the front pages of all newspapers. The second fight is to find the new Christ. And that's what I talk about in episode 9, Catching the Golden State Killer, the exposed Illuminati plot to find and create Jesus. When you have companies with billions of dollars out there building DNA databases, and they are harvesting DNA all over the globe, both voluntarily and involuntarily, in countries where you don't have regulations like we have in the US, you have to ask yourself why. Why are they building these global databases? One would say because they want to create medicines that would make them billions. That could be one argument. But really, collecting it when people aren't giving it to you voluntarily tells me there is a greater motive, a bigger picture that they're looking at beyond medicines. They want a global database so that they can find the Christ and either find and kill or find and create their own. Because it's always been about that blood, about that consciousness that comes with it. So what does that say? What does that imply about who God is? I think I can now tackle that question now that we have set the table on the gardens of Eden and Jesus' role in it. Now we can start to ask the question and ponder the answer of who God is. Now that we know that this plane of creation happened when God's Spirit hovered above the waters and those waters became imbued with His Spirit. Right. Some people argue the same thought experiment that I asked you to do in a previous episode, that's what God was doing in the first 6 verses of Genesis. You remember that thought experiment, right? You've seen, if you have a pet, times when you thought the pet, cat or dog, was in one part of the house, and when you looked, you saw the pet. It was there. It was looking back at you. Only to realize that wasn't the pet. It was somewhere else in the house. The moment at which you realized it was somewhere else in the house, the image of the pet that was in front of you disappeared. Was that animal real that you created in your mind? Absolutely. You'd created matter from nothing. Some people argue that if there were more than 2 focused on the same object, they could pull that matter into this plane. I know it gets weird because you have all sorts of guys, Aleister Crowley and others, that push the limits of what's called this black magic. And so I want each of you to understand why I have a view of what this chapter, Genesis, really means and what it's speaking to and what we are required to do in order to seek that salvation. Because what's happening in front of us is a reemergence of an artificial construct to divide us and separate us from a divine consciousness. They don't want us to wake up. They don't want us to reconnect. Because in that moment, we all become empathetic to each other. We lose ourselves in the love for each other. And that changes all of what we fight for. Under the paradigm they want us to exist in, we think only of ourselves. We think only in terms of finite resources, and we fight each other and fuel them with our grief. And we need to change that. Guys, I've run out of kombucha, but I've enjoyed this episode because it took me on so many turns and twists, looking up words to try to understand if what I was reading actually meant the things that I thought in my mind. And as I dug deeper into the Hebrew words, it became clearer and clearer to me. But if I'm off track, join the conversation. Follow me on Instagram, Twitter at Event Horizon, Facebook at Event Horizon, and let me know your thoughts. But you gotta make me one promise. Never, ever tell my priest about this podcast. I enjoy going to church. I do not want to be tarred and feathered. But I'm not going to stop thinking outside of the box. Guys, join me on June 3rd on the Spreaker platform as I do my bonus material follow-up to this episode. Because I go back and listen and see if I missed anything, and then I'm going to give you some additional material. And you can interact with me and chat alongside other people in the chat room as we talk about where is the Garden of Eden. Follow me on Twitter and Facebook, and you'll find out the specific time when I'm going to do that live broadcast of the bonus material of where is the Garden of Eden. Till next time, guys, peace.